Everyone online is yapping nonstop about how Moana 2 started out as a Disney Plus show before it was eventually turned into a movie. Blah blah blah, that's cool and all, but for me, it's boring because we'll probably never know the exact details of how that all went down behind the scenes. But I found something else. In this interview, another production fact was mentioned, and it was small, but it's important because it shows just how the animation industry is changing, and it's super cool, and no one's talking about it. Welcome to Animation Hustle, the place where we dive into the funny and untold stories behind your favorite animated movies and TV shows. Don't forget to subscribe and visit the Discord because today we're talking about Moana 2. Okay, so before we get into Moana 2, we gotta talk about the first Moana because the behind-the-scenes story of making that movie is absolutely legendary. What you probably don't realize is that Moana almost broke Disney animation. You see, there were so many failures behind the scenes that they almost ran out of time to make the movie. Basically, the entire studio had to lock in to finish it. It was all hands on deck to the very last minute, and even one of the movie's best and most iconic scenes wasn't even created until the very end of the process. Okay, so real quick, this is John Musker. He is one of the directors of Moana and a bunch of other Disney classics. During a discussion, he broke down all the many struggles of making Moana, and it's actually crazy how much of a disaster this thing was.
And this movie was very much a struggle. You know, it was really hard.
So first, getting the characters right was a big challenge.
Issues with, and we kept going around on her, how selfless is she, how selfish is she? In some versions, we were going with the idea almost like she's like the person who grew up in a small town who wanted to get out of a small town, go to the big city, and she just wanted to get out. And then, but it was like, but that didn't seem so sympathetic. In some ways you could relate to it, but, you know, and so eventually we came up with this thing that really, the island was in jeopardy. She had to leave the island in order to save it, and she had to risk her own life to help her people. And it wasn't a selfish reason, it really was, she was trying to save her people, and in so doing, she connected with her own past. Maui was a challenge because he was kind of an egomaniac, and there were earlier versions of the story where Moana was abandoned down the underworld by Maui, who once he got his hook back said, "I'm out of here." He left her in the underworld, seemingly to die, and it's like, it was so unsympathetic, we could never redeem him after that, no matter what we did.
And then they also wanted to showcase the incredible culture that inspired the movie. So they kind of struggled to find a way to do everything as respectfully as possible.
There was cultural things, musical things, costuming things, language things. Early on, we had a choice, because when we were going to do the movie after we'd been in the islands, there were a couple things. One thing, when we met them, they were very concerned about stereotyping in the movies. They felt like many movies that have been done in the Pacific Islands have stereotyped us. That was inspiring to us to try and keep that in our minds as we made the movie. There's a mix of all these different cultures from the Pacific, but we liked it that we were really trying to do a movie about Polynesian culture. And there are 31,000 islands in the Pacific. We learned that as we got there. There's Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Arbitrary distinctions that when we got to the Pacific, they said, we don't like those distinctions. We think of this whole place as Oceania. It's a continent. If you took just even the area of Micronesia, which is a small part of it, the mass of that water could fit, it's the blueprint of the United States. That's how big that area of water is. If you take all the islands that are in Micronesia and you put them together, it would form Rhode Island, basically. So that's how vast the waters are compared to the land masses. However, the people there felt very strongly that they were people of the land and the sea, that there wasn't a division between them. And so one of the themes of our movie that we came away from the islands with is the idea of interconnectedness. I mean, it was connection between man and nature, between people and their ancestors, between islands, you know, land and sea, all that. It became one of our thematic ideas.
But the hardest thing to get right wasn't what you might expect.
It's the hardest part of making these movies is not the animation, is not the special effects, it's not the ocean, it's not the tattoos. It's the friggin' story!
It was absolutely a team effort. Writers and directors from all over Disney came together to perfect this story.
And so there was a lot of churn on the movie of, you know, people not thinking this worked or that worked, or there were times where Maui was superseding Moana and it was more his story than hers. And so that was kind of torture to figure out how do we rework that. And the story was enough torture that 2/3 of the way through, Chris Williams and Don Hall, who had directed Big Hero 6, came on board, and their focus really was the story. They began working with the story guys, and we moved more into production aspects, animation and layout and all this, and they were working closely with the story guys to try and solve some of these problems. And Jared Bush came on at that point, the writer from Zootopia, and John Ripa, who was a wonderful story artist, had been an animator. So they were kind of a SWAT team who came on and did an enormous job of helping clarify the story, solving some of those story problems, and while we sort of kept the story moving.
But even with the deadline approaching, they were able to create one of the movie's best scenes.
You know, the paint is still wet when the movie gets in the theater sometimes, and one of the last sequences we animated was the Tamatoa song, Shiny.
All this stuff really wasn't talked about when the first movie came out, so it's interesting to hear. Back in the day, the main behind-the-scenes highlight was the hair and the water. The animators and technicians at Disney spent tons of time and money making sure the hair looks great, and at the time, it was pretty remarkable. Like, think about it, CGI hair started out like this, but in Moana, it looked like this. And the same thing with the water. All those technological advancements were mind-blowing, which brings us to Moana 2. When it was first announced, I was really excited to see what other amazing technological feats they would pull off in this movie. And I found an interview where the new directors were asked about it, and their response was low-key, kind of underwhelming.
Are there any new technologies or animation techniques that weren't available for the first one and that you used in the second one?
I've got one.
Yeah? Oh, jump in.
Ropes. Ropes were so difficult on the first film. They were one of the hardest things, and it just broke everyone's brain.
Yeah.
And they figured out ropes.
Yeah.
That's right, forget the hair in the water. Be sure to look out for the ropes in Moana 2. Now, if you're an animation weirdo like me, this can seem kind of disappointing, but the fact that we are getting to a point where we have to get hyped about ropes is actually pretty amazing. And no one explains it better than Brad Bird, Pixar director.
The medium of computer animation is mature enough now that the improvements are not as easy to discuss, but they're harder to talk with the press about. In the early days, it was like, we're finally able to do eyes, you know? And, you know, in Monsters, Inc., it was fur, we've got fur. I'm here to confirm, we have fur! Then it would be Nemo, you know, we have underwater lighting. With incredible, our whole film was constructed of things, all the things that computers were still bad at. I got this idea for a film filled with humans and cloth and fire and water, and that's all it is. And the speed of the improvements have slowed in the sense that they're easy to see, but there are many. And the most significant one on this film was that we can do a low resolution render of a lit frame and see it pretty quickly. It looks very grainy, kind of like a 16 millimeter film, but you can see all the lighting in there and you can judge it. And so the ability to judge a lit shot without waiting for 3 days for it to be rendered is really huge. And it means that you can iterate on it and you can try different things and see what you're doing. So we have 1 million improvements, and The Incredibles looks more how we wanted the first one to look.
So Moana 1 was a major struggle. The animators and filmmakers built upon all that groundwork and used new technology to make Moana 2 slightly less of a struggle. So what are your thoughts on all this? CGI is getting so good. We can do more realistic stuff like the ropes in Moana, or more abstract artistic stuff like everything we saw in Wild Robot. If you want to see more behind the scenes animation videos, check this out, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
You know, the hardest part of making these movies is not the animation, is not the special effects, it's not the ocean, it's not the tattoos. It's the friggin' story.